All right, so get ready because we are diving headfirst into something pretty major happening in Ontario. It's all about higher education, but not just like what classes are being offered. We're talking about international students and the role they play, which is honestly causing a lot of debate right now. People are worried about funding for schools, if it's fair to everyone involved, and honestly, what's going to happen to these places like colleges and universities in the future.
Yeah, no, it's huge, and it seems like it's about so much more than just education, right? I mean, when you really get into it, we're talking about the economy, housing, even how Canada interacts with other countries on a global level. It's a lot.
Totally. It's like that thing where you pull on a loose thread and then, boom, the whole sweater's coming undone.
Mm.
So to help us untangle all this, we're going deep on a piece by Randall Denley, who was in the National Post recently. He goes hard on this whole Ontario Students First idea. And let me tell you, people have some strong feelings about it.
And how could they not? We're talking about over 500,000 international students just in Ontario. Think about that. That's like the size of some entire provinces. They're a huge part of how things work now, especially financially for these schools.
No, for sure. It's kind of wild when you look at the actual numbers. Denley points out that over in colleges, almost a third of their money, like 31% of it, comes straight from international student fees.
Yeah.
That's massive. So then you got to ask, what happens if that money just stops coming in?
Right. $1 million question for sure. Do these colleges have to make big cuts, raise prices for students from Ontario? Or does the government have to step in and make up for that lost cash? These aren't just what if scenarios, these are real possibilities depending on what happens.
Totally. So yeah, the stakes are really high. But I think before we go any further, we should probably talk about the thing that really threw gasoline on this fire. So back in April, Premier Doug Ford, he makes this comment, and it kind of sent shockwaves through everything. He's talking about schools, and he just casually drops in our kids first, just like that.
Mhm.
You could practically hear jaws hitting the floor. So what was that about? Political maneuvering? Honestly believes it. Or was it like a slip-up that actually revealed a bigger change in how the Ontario government sees international students?
Well, Denley seems to think it's more than a slip up, that's for sure. He's arguing there's this growing feeling, and not just in Ontario, that maybe, just maybe, we've gone a bit overboard favoring international students. And to be fair, there are good points on both sides of this whole thing.
For sure. On the one hand, and Denley lays this out really well, saying Ontario students first could mean more spots in those programs that are super competitive, maybe even cheaper tuition if the government helps out with the money situation we were just talking about, and even a better chance of getting a good job after graduation. But it's not exactly simple, is it? It's not like flipping a switch.
Nope, not at all. And that's where the other side comes in. I mean, international students, they bring a lot to the table. And no, I'm not just talking about the money, although that's a big part of it, obviously. But they make campuses more interesting, bring different ideas, and tons of them end up staying in Canada after they graduate, working, making lives here.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
And it gets, I don't know, maybe a little awkward when we start talking about jobs.
Mm.
Denley doesn't shy away from this at all. He straight up says a lot of businesses, especially certain types, rely on international students as workers.
Yeah, that's the thing. Nobody really wants to say out loud, right? Like, are we relying on them for cheaper labor? Is that even okay? Is it sustainable in the long run? And what about everyone else in Ontario who needs those jobs? What happens to them? We can't ignore these questions if we're being for real about all this.
And then he takes it somewhere I really wasn't expecting, but it makes total sense when you actually think about it. It's like
Well,
we're not just talking about schools here, right? We're talking about how Canada deals with other countries, like on a global level.
it's true. And Denley really hits on this whole other layer that people might not even think about when they're picturing international students in Ontario. Most of them, and this goes for Canada in general, not just Ontario, but most of them are coming from, well, two main places, India and China. And that's huge EEE if we're even thinking about cutting back on those numbers. It changes things with how Canada gets along with those countries, which are major players, obviously.
Yeah. It's like we're not just deciding who gets into a class and we're kind of messing with trade deals, who even likes us internationally, even where the best and brightest people in the world end up working in the future. It gets kind of big, kind of fast.
Totally, it does. And it makes you think, are we like accidentally taking all the smart people from those places? Like come here for school, love it, decide to stay and make a life here. Is that good? Bad? Somewhere in between.
Makes you wonder if we're basically training our competition in a way, even if it's not intentional.
Right. And then it all loops back to those job questions we were talking about, the kind of awkward ones.
Hmm.
If we're attracting all these super qualified people, what does that even do to certain jobs here? How do you make it fair for everyone? while still saying, yeah, international students bring a lot of good stuff to the table.
And Denley, he just throws this bomb out there at the end, and it stuck with me. He's like, what's smarter for Ontario? Spending billions on something like a factory, or taking that same money and putting it towards making our schools so good they can handle anyone from here or anywhere else.
Right. It's that whole if you build it, they'll come versus grow your own talent kind of debate, which is something governments are always dealing with. Sure, you get those factories in here, maybe create some jobs quickly, boost things up in the short term. But what Denley's getting at is maybe we've forgotten about playing the long game, like really investing in people, in their education, which could pay off for a really long time, maybe even generations.
It really feels like we're at this crossroads, doesn't it? Like, are we going to keep doing what we've been doing, or are we going to actually commit to building something better, something that benefits everyone in the long run?
And that's where that Ontario students first thing gets really interesting, right? Because if we're being honest, if that wasn't just like a soundbite, if Ford actually means it, then whoa, we're talking about a huge change. But that's the thing, isn't it? Saying it is one thing, but can we actually pull it off?
Exactly. It's easy to say, right? But are we talking about, like, starting from scratch almost? Throwing tons of money at schools, figuring out how to make it work without relying on international students so much. It's a lot.
It is, and honestly, Denley doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he does leave us with this, like, challenge, you know? He's basically saying if we're serious about this whole Ontario Students First thing, then we got to really change how we think about it. We got to be willing to put our money where our mouth is, but not just on, like, buildings and stuff. Invest in the people, the teachers, the programs, all that, so students here can actually, like, thrive.
So it's got to be about more than just getting more people into classes, right? It's about making sure those people can actually graduate and get good jobs, compete with anyone, anywhere.
Right. It's like, are we actually preparing them for what's out there? Maybe we need to rethink what we're even teaching, get businesses more involved, even stop focusing so much on grades all the time.
It's tough because investing in people, that's not a quick fix, you know? It's like planting a tree. You got to wait years to see the results. But when it works, when you have all these smart, skilled people, that's when things get really interesting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you think, what do we actually value? What matters most to us here? It goes way beyond budgets and spreadsheets, you know?
Yeah.
It's about what we want Ontario to look like in the future and how education is going to get us there.
So there you have it, a deep dive into one of the most important issues facing Ontario today. It's messy, it's complicated, but it's a conversation we all need to be having.